everyone, and welcome to episode 260 of the Medieval Podcast. I'm Danièle Cybulskie, also known as the 5-Minute Medievalist. Most of us probably came across English kings Richard II and Henry IV through the works of Shakespeare, maybe even recently by watching these plays together in the series The Hollow Crown. Richard II came to the throne as a young child, only to lose it to his cousin Henry in 1399. But why did Henry take such drastic action? And what became of the teenage boy who stood up to a crowd of angry peasants and held his own? This week, I spoke with Dr. Helen Castor about rival cousins and kings, Richard II and Henry IV. Helen is a former professor and director of studies in history at Sydney Sussex College at the University of Cambridge, and the award-winning author of Blood and Roses, The Paston Family and the Wars of the Roses, She-Wolves, the Women Who Ruled England Before Elizabeth, and Joan of Arc, A History. Her new book is The Eagle and the Hart, The Tragedy of Richard II and Henry IV. Our conversation on the events that shaped these two kings, what it was that set them on a collision course, and how an anointed king could lose his hollow crown is coming up right after this. Well, welcome back, Helen. It's always so good to see you. We've already been chatting for almost 15 minutes, but it's time to start talking about your book. Welcome back.
Thank you so much for having me, Danièle. It's fantastic to be with you.
Oh, I'm always happy to speak to you. All right, so we've been talking about this book that you've been working on for years, and I've been so excited about it coming out. Why did you want to talk about Richard II and Henry IV in conjunction? Because it's a book that really brings the two together. Why did you want to do that as a project?
So many reasons, but I think what it boils down to, one is that I've always been interested in power. How do you actually govern a medieval kingdom when you have no professional police force, you have no standing army, you have no modern transport, you have no modern communications, you are one man, you're the king? That kind of structural issue has always fascinated me. So the deposition of a king, what brings England to this point in 1399 when Richard actually loses his throne? And he loses his throne to his first cousin, a man almost exactly the same age, so closely related to him, but such an utterly different person in terms of temperament, in terms of experience, in terms of attitude to the world, that I wanted to see if I could write a psychological portrait of these two and to do it together so that you would understand not just Richard II, who is a fascinating character, but if anybody knows anything about him, it's from Shakespeare. He's the central figure in one of the greatest and most beautiful of Shakespeare's plays, whereas Henry is a much shadowier figure. He's the agent of Richard's fall in Shakespeare's Richard II. And then in the plays that bear his name, he's in the background while Prince Hal and Falstaff and Hotspur fight it out at the front of the stage. So I wanted to give Henry his due and see exactly what it was about the relationship between these two men that played out in the drama of 1399.
Yes, and I mean, we definitely need to get to that critical point. It's really good point that you're making in that, Henry IV actually has two plays in his name, and he's almost forgettable. But we should leave Shakespeare aside.
Well, right? Exactly, because actually I think Henry is one of the most fascinating human beings I've ever written about. And there he is sandwiched between Richard II, one of the worst medieval kings, and Henry V, his own son, one of the greatest medieval kings. And his reign is complicated. It's full of drama, but drama that was difficult for him and the country to survive. But actually the human being at the centre is so human, and I think so fascinating when you dig in.
Yes, so let's do it. So let's start at the beginning. Who is Richard II? What time are we talking about? Set the scene for us, Richard II's ascension to the throne.
Richard II becomes King of England in 1377 at the age of 10. And this is a very bad time to have a king who's 10, because England has been at war for decades by this point with France in what we know as the 100 Years' War. Obviously, the people of Richard's kingdom didn't know it was the 100 Years' War. They didn't know how many years there were left on the clock. But they did know that after decades of really very successful fighting, the triumphs of Crécy and Poitiers and Calais and great victories, and the fighting happening over there in France, now in the 1370s, everything was starting to go very badly. And the fighting was heading England's way. The south coast was beginning to face French raids. And the difficulty politically was that the great King Edward III, who had been the glorious warrior king of this earlier phase of the war, was old and he was ill. And his son, the Black Prince, another military hero, was not old but also ill. And the Black Prince died in 1376. And that means the crown has to skip a generation and come to rest on the head of this little boy in 1377. It's a frightening moment because he's the one with the right to rule, but he's not yet old enough. So England's nobles have to find a way of keeping government and the war going until they hope soon he'll be old enough to rule for himself.
Yeah, so he's being raised with his father being ill for years, with the expectation he's going to be king, and he knows it. And I always have some sympathy for Richard II because there was no way that this kid was going to turn out okay. So tell us a little bit about his upbringing and how he was expected to be a king from the time he was very small.
He really was. He was his father's only surviving legitimate child. He had had an older brother, Edward. There should have been Edward IV, the Black Prince, after Edward III, and then Edward V. It could all have been so different. But little Edward died when he was very young, and Richard was left as the only surviving child, legitimate child of the Black Prince. And as you say, for as long as he could remember, his father had been not a great campaigning warrior, but an invalid, suffering with a chronic illness, which meant that, given that his grandfather Edward III was also ailing by this time, he'd never actually seen kingship in action. He'd never had a chance to see what the job actually entailed. What he had known was being brought up within a very magnificent but closed-off household focused around an invalid, with himself really wrapped in cotton wool as far as it's possible to tell. We don't have day-by-day details of his education, but we certainly have the sense that he was being prepared for kingship only in terms of being told that he was unique, he was irreplaceable, he had to be protected at all costs. So, as you say, it's a complicated family in some ways. It's a blended family, we would call it, because very unusually, his mother had been married before. She had a much more checkered history than most royal brides. And so Richard had older half brothers and half sisters, but they had no claim to the throne. So within this large and magnificent and complicated household, he was unique, he was special.
Yes. And you mention it as a cocoon, sort of like a magnificent cocoon. And this is something that he wants to keep around himself forever. But when he steps out of it, he recognizes that things are not as he expected. So when does he start appearing on the political stage? Because he appears on the political stage pretty early, and probably the highlight of his life during the Peasants' Revolt, right?
He does. I mean, his earliest appearances are ceremonial, and we have to remember that he was crowned and anointed at the age of 10. So this is what he's been looking forward to. This is a recognition of his sacred status, absolutely extraordinary ceremony, all focused on him and the role that God has given him. But as he then starts looking around himself at government, he's being told that he's ruling because there's no regency put in place. The difficulty is that his most powerful nobleman is his uncle, John of Gaunt, the greatest magnate in the country. If anyone's going to be a regent, it has to be him. He can't be passed over. But Gaunt is so unpopular because the war is going badly, politics has become extremely fractious, people in the country blame him for everything that's going wrong. So he can't be regent, but no one else can be regent instead. So they fudge it. They say there is no minority. The king is ruling, and Richard hears this as much as anyone else. But as he looks around him, he thinks, well, no one is doing what I say. So 4 years after his coronation, what we call the Peasants' Revolt happens. Thousands of working men and some women from across the southeast converge on London to protest at what they see as a corrupt and failing government. It's a terrifying moment. They storm the Tower, they burn down John of Gaunt's palace of the Savoy, they take over London. And the noblemen around the king are frightened, and they have reason to be frightened. The Chancellor and the Treasurer of England get seized by the rebels. They have their heads brutally hacked off and paraded on pikes through the city. This is real danger. And Richard rides out to the rebels to engage with them, to talk to their leaders, to say, what is it you want, my people? Mm-hmm. And it is a moment of great bravery and great poise from this 14-year-old boy. But what I think we have to remember, brave though he undoubtedly is that the rebels were blaming the noblemen around him for everything that was going wrong. They were not blaming him. What they were doing was looking to their king for help, for guidance, for the exercise of the authority that they believed should be his. And Richard agreed with them. Mm-hmm. Richard knew that he was not in any danger from these rebels. They had a sort of password they were using when they met people on the roads around London. They would say, with whom hold you? And the right answer was, with King Richard and the true commons. And if you didn't come out with that answer, you weren't going to live very much longer. So Richard and the rebels saw eye to eye in this very, very important conclusion. And they also agreed that the men who were running his government were not doing a good job and were overstepping their bounds. So you get the scene set in this great confrontation for actually how Richard sees his own government in the years that followed. He believed that his greatest nobles, far from just trying to keep the plates spinning as he was growing up, were actually standing in his way, were betraying the authority that God had given him. And that's what you see play out as you get into the mid-1380s, Richard growing through his teens until a great confrontation happens in 1386, when the war is going disastrously, but that's not how Richard sees it.
Yes, let's get to that in a second. I just want to re-emphasize this in that, imagine you're a 14-year-old boy, you're always told that you're special, and then there you are in front of thousands of people who tell you that you are special, you are the one who they are looking towards for guidance, as you say. And that moment, I think, really sort of calcified everything he'd always been taught, so that for the rest of his life, he was like, well, I have a perfect example here. Thousands of people told me that I was right. And I think he just holds on to that forever.
Exactly. And follow him. He says the great confrontation with Wat Tyler Smithfield, when Tyler ends up getting killed in this great moment of potential chaos. It's Richard who rides forward and says to the rebels, I will be your captain. And they follow him. They're looking to him as their savior. And this is very much a conclusion that Richard already has in his mind. I mean, there's one astonishing moment, it seems to me, even just 6 months before he becomes king. He's brought into Parliament to be shown to the people as, it doesn't matter that the Black Prince has just died. It doesn't matter that the king is ill. Look, the future is in good hands, this royal boy. And the speech that the Chancellor makes in introducing him literally says, the king has sent this prince to you just as God sent his only beloved son, he who is looked for by all men. And even if everybody else there knew that was political rhetoric, it's a 10-year-old boy being described in his own presence as England's Messiah. And the rebels in 1381 confirm that opinion. I think you're so right. And he's looking for that forever after.
Yes, and he holds on to it. And one of the things that you mentioned later on in the book is that he has no understanding later of what's led to this point, because everything seemed to be leading him in the direction of always being divinely right. So I think that we really need to stay on that point for a minute, in that it's going to be important later to look at what he's doing later and understand why he's doing things that might seem otherwise crazy.
I think that is so important. And here's one of the points where we also get a little parallel to think about with Henry's story. Henry, his cousin, who's only 3 months younger than him, almost exactly the same age, son of John of Gaunt, who is the most hated man in England at this point. Henry is in the Tower at the point where it gets overrun by the rebels. And he is so vulnerable in that moment. His father is hundreds of miles away on the Scottish border. And the rebels hate his father so much that the risk of Gaunt's son being murdered is extreme and very real. And we know that Henry, in fact, was saved from death only by the kindness of one particular rebel, a smallholder from Kent, who recognized him and saved his life. And we know this because 20 years later, when Henry became king, he pardoned him another offence and said in the pardon that it was because he'd wondrously and kindly saved his life back in 1381. So Henry's getting a taste of the reality of political conflict and political violence. And Richard's getting a taste of the unreality of being viewed as a royal messiah.
Yes, absolutely. And I'm glad that you brought that out because it really does shape them. They're both 14-year-old boys. And we know that things that happen in high school are things that stick with you, right?
They really, really do.
All right. So you've talked about 1386. This is 5 years later. What happens in 1386? Because it's not great.
It's not great. So they're both 19 by this point, Richard and Henry, but it's Richard that the crisis focuses on, unsurprisingly. The war is going appallingly badly for England by 1386, to the point where a French armada is gathering at a Flemish port, ready to launch the biggest invasion of England since the conquest of 1066. It's a terrifying moment. And the parliament that gathers in the late summer, the early autumn of 1386, is terrified about what might happen and focused on the desperate need to marshal defences against this coming invasion. And they are blaming Richard's chief minister, who by this stage is his chancellor, a man in his household who he's been seeing as a way of asserting his authority within government, a man called Michael de la Pole. And they want de la Pole removed from office, and they tell Richard this. Now, you'd think that with a French fleet about to appear any minute, Richard might have a sense that there are bigger issues than what's going on with his ministers, but Richard doesn't. Richard struggles always to see anyone other than himself, anything other than himself, as real and meaningful. And so he interprets this as an attack on his own authority. And he says he wouldn't, at the request of his parliament, dismiss a scullion from his kitchen. Not tactful, not helpful. And Gaunt by this stage has gone to fight abroad. So the opposition to what Richard is doing or not doing is led by his youngest uncle, Thomas of Woodstock, who goes to see Richard and says, come on now, we've got to sort this out. And Richard says, if you persist with this insolence, I will ask my cousin, the King of France, for help against you. Now that is delusional. The idea that the King of France and his forces are about to invade, your parliament's trying to get you to focus on that. You're going to ask the King of France for help because he's another king who will understand that these uppity subjects should not be challenging you. Woodstock then reminds him of the fate of Edward II, his great-grandfather, who had been deposed back in 1327. And Richard realizes, okay, things are a bit more serious than he thought, but it doesn't lead him to see the light and see the problem and see where he's gone wrong. He's forced into complying with the appointment of a council to take over his government and so on. But it becomes clear that actually he's biding his time and he regards all of this as treason. The invasion doesn't come in the end because of the weather. The wind doesn't go in the right direction and the fleet is too big for its own good in the end. So the scare, that's why we haven't heard of the French Armada of 1386. But of course, the people living through it didn't know that this invasion wasn't, in fact, going to arrive.
Mm-hmm. They would be expecting it and they would be frightened. And at the same time, there are all of these invasions, smaller ones that are happening along the coast. And everyone is quite upset that the king does not care enough about this.
doesn't seem to see the reality of what's going on. Yeah.
No, I think that that is very true in that he's actually not understanding it and in conceptual terms as being as real as everything that's going on within his daily life. I think that is absolutely correct. So he's starting to collect grudges and he's starting to collect favorites. And I think it's important to recognize that people are starting to look at him as Edward II in certain ways because of his favorites. So can you tell us a little bit about what's going on with the people that Richard likes best?
People that Richard likes best are the people around him in his household, a collection of young noblemen who he doesn't see as a threat because they've been his friends from childhood, insofar as he really has friends. But first among them is Robert de Vere, the Earl of Oxford, who's 5 years older than Richard, and really the only person, as we'll see, really in Richard's life, whose interests Richard ever put ahead of his own. One of the chroniclers says that de Vere was Richard's whole heart, that if de Vere said black was white, that Richard wouldn't contradict him. So the problem in 1386 is not the king has favourites full stop. It's not a thing that stands on its own. The problem is that a French fleet is about to invade, and Richard has been, if left to his own devices, heading in the other direction with de Vere, concentrating on all the great gifts and titles he's giving him. So it's the problem that the king's priorities seem completely upside down, if not just unrecognisable from what the rest of the political community think is important. The fact that Londoners are being asked to prepare for a siege as the French are about to appear in the Channel. So there is such a gulf of understanding between Richard and his subjects at this point. And when the council takes over government, Richard and de Vere and various others within his household take off. They go off travelling around the country instead of cooperating, instead of helping put their shoulders to the wheel. And during this almost a year of travelling, it's clear that Richard is preparing his weapons against what's happening. He summons his judges to him and gets them to say that everyone who does anything against the king's will, who forces the king to do something against his will, or persuades the king to do something against his will, should be punished as a traitor. And if that's allowed to stand, then the whole project of advising the king becomes untenable. Because if you advise the king to do something and he then turns around and says, actually, no, you talked me into that and I didn't want to do it, you're a traitor. It's giving the definition of treason, this most terrible of crimes, over to the king. And this king is not a king you can trust.
Yes, definitely. He's not a king you can trust. And I think that maybe people in the modern world expect that this is normal kingship where you can just say, nope, off with their head here and there. But this is absolutely not what it was until this time, until Richard decided to rewrite the rules, right?
That's right. The king's job is to uphold the rule of law and provide his people with justice. And that is only going to work. I mean, in one sense, the king has to be above the law, because otherwise, where does the law come from? The law comes from God through the king. That's true. But the constitution, this system of government, is only going to work if the king accepts that he must abide by the rules of law that he has promised to uphold and impose on his subjects. And that's been clear in England for, you can go back to Magna Carta. That's one of the key principles that's established in Magna Carta. And Richard's great-grandfather, Edward III, has codified the law of treason in a statute to make clear that this most terrible weapon in the hands of the king, because if you're a traitor, you not only get executed in the most horrible way, but your lands are forfeited and therefore your family is destroyed forever. That treason is very closely defined. It's not something that can simply be used as a weapon at the king's discretion or will. And Richard's trying to change all that because that's how he sees his own power. Wrongly, but that's how he sees it.
Well, and it's interesting because you can see Edward III in his time trying to codify this so that it's forever clear to everyone. And then in Richard's rule, you see throughout the book, people are swearing oaths here, but then they have to break them, but then they're swearing another one here. And all of these things that are supposed to be perpetually true are not true. So we're talking about trust.
We
There it
really
is.
are. And that's such a good point, because what Edward III had recognized was that if there is that trust between a king and his people, and if those rules are clear and everyone knows where they stand, the king only gets more powerful because he can call on his subjects within that structure of trust and understanding and law. And people have no reason not to trust and serve him. So in a sense, it's a win-win situation. Whereas once you start going the other way, it's a catch-22. Yes, the king might promise this today, but if he changes his mind tomorrow, and if you swear this today, but he changes the basis of what you're swearing to tomorrow, trust is lost. The mechanism stops working because no one knows how its individual bits fit together anymore. And that's what you see play out, that sense of any solid ground on which to stand starts falling away. And you see it in the response to Richard's redefinition of treason, because if I may go on to
Yes,
1388,
let's keep moving.
that once it's clear what Richard is doing, Thomas of Woodstock, his uncle, and some other leading nobles, the Earl of Arundel and the Earl of Warwick, decide that they are going to have to arm themselves against him, that they've already gone far enough that they can't trust this king who has just told them they're traitors. So that's what they do. They gather forces. They end up challenging the king and saying, we need to remove the people around you. Now, it's not that they necessarily actually believe that it's the fault of the people around Richard, but that's what they're going to have to do, because otherwise they're making war on the king, and they definitely are traitors. So what they do is they say, no, the people around you are traitors. And Richard says, okay, we can have a parliament. We'll try all this in parliament. And Richard once again lies. He lets them all escape. He's not going to comply with what he's promised. And at that point, two more younger noblemen join the opposition, the rebel lords. One of them is a man called Thomas Mowbray, the Earl of Nottingham, and the other is our friend Henry, son of John of Gaunt, Richard's cousin. In other words, Henry, who's been left in charge of his father's interests, the Duchy of Lancaster interests, at home in England while Gaunt is abroad, has recognised the degree of the danger, and he's thought, I'm going to have to stand up here. I'm going to have to stand up with the others. But it's a very frightening and a very dangerous decision that he makes at that point.
Yes, and there are always going to be repercussions. So everything settles out eventually. Richard's favorites get dispersed everywhere. Most of them have an escape, that they are not actually convicted of treason and executed. They are
convicted. They're convicted
yes.
in their absence, but he's allowed them to flee abroad, so they're not executed. But some are executed in this Parliament of 1388, which gets called the Merciless Parliament. It's an example of exactly what you were pointing at a minute ago, that because Richard is being so threatening to his subjects, these rebel lords, the 5 rebel lords, have to go further in opposing him, and they take the law into their own hands, really, in this parliament. So they've done things that are worrying and unjustifiable, in that they're making up procedures in parliament to justify executing not the leading favourites, but men including Richard's former tutor, Simon Burley. So blood has been shed, not by the king at this point, but by the people standing up to him. So we're already through the looking glass here.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, I was trying to find a way of saying, like, these people were executed, but these people were not executed. It's something that you spell out very clearly in the book, but you're trying to do it in a quick way. So as you have this young Henry, he's on the side of the people who are, it's hard to call them rebels at this point because they end up being on the side of right, but they've gone a lot farther than he was comfortable going. So how does he react to this sort of in the aftermath of this? Is he okay with it? How does this affect Henry?
It's a complicated piece that descends from 1389. Richard has had enough of a shock to his system that he realizes he's going to have to take a step back, rebuild. Gaunt comes home from fighting abroad, and Gaunt has gone away as the most unpopular man in England, and he comes back, the one person who hasn't been involved in this horrifying chaos, and everyone's so pleased to see him because he comes back as an elder statesman who can hopefully calm everything down. So there is a period of the calm after the storm. Richard is being circumspect. He's not pushing the boundaries for a while, and Henry takes the opportunity to put some distance between himself and his cousin, a strategic absence from England. which also gives him the opportunity to go on the medieval chivalric equivalent of a grand tour of Europe. The first thing he does is go off to a very glamorous tournament in France, convened by a French knight called Boucicaut. By this stage, there's been a truce between England and France, which means they can embark on some chivalric games instead of war in earnest. And Henry makes a great name for himself at this tournament. He's a great jouster. He's a very charismatic young man. And having done that, he then decides, well, what does a charismatic knight do? He goes on crusade. And the available crusade at this point is a crusade in Prussia and Lithuania being conducted by the Teutonic Knights, an order of crusading knights. So he goes off, crusades in Lithuania with a group of very close friends, acquits himself admirably and honorably there, thinks he'll do some more of that, but the next time he goes back, the weather has knocked out that particular crusading season. The wilderness, the Lithuanian wilderness, is too marshy or unpassable. And so he decides then he will go on as a pilgrim and he will go to Jerusalem. And so he travels not with a military retinue, but a peacetime retinue through the great courts of Europe, feted wherever he goes, admired wherever he goes, until he reaches Jerusalem, which is an overwhelming spiritual experience for the faithful in this period. And it's a place where even the great crusading kings of England, Richard the Lionheart, Edward I, had not set foot. And so he reappears in England after these glamorous travels as an even more glamorous and accomplished figure. He now knows many of the great political leaders in Europe. And he arrives with this rather extraordinary baggage train back at home in Peterborough, where his young wife, Mary, is waiting for him with their young children, 4 young sons and a new baby girl. He brings Mary a parrot as a present, but he also brings an ostrich from Prague and what is usually called a leopard that he'd been given by the King of Cyprus, but I'm absolutely convinced that it's a hunting cheetah, because hunting with cheetahs was a practice that had been brought into the Eastern Mediterranean from the Arab world. And I suspect this was a hunting cheetah, although whether it was entirely welcome at home in Peterborough, I'm not sure.
You have to keep it away from the ostrich.
Exactly.
Yes, but this grand tour that he's going on, I think that visiting Jerusalem was probably really good for him spiritually, because it seems as his life progresses that he does have regrets, that he does feel things deeply, I think is what I'm trying to say. So he's making all of these friends and alliances that he's not looking at, I don't think, looking at as alliances at this moment, but they are firm friendships that will hold him in good stead later. And at the same time, Richard is biding his time and he's gathering his grudges. So what happens next? I think we kind of need to push our timeline to get everything in.
We do.
So we're getting close to the end of the 1390s. What's happening with Richard?
Okay, I'll try and do this in headline fashion to see where we get to. Richard is biding his time, but he's making preparations. He is gathering his own private retinue. Normally, kings don't need a private retinue because they can command the whole kingdom. But Richard is bestowing his badge of the White Hart on various retainers and servants and knights and esquires and archers. So he seems to be building up the makings of a private army. It's all fine so far, but you begin to wonder, why does a king need a private army in his own kingdom, particularly when he's also making peace with France? Richard has never been a fighter. He doesn't want to lead armies against France. So he can't make a permanent peace. It's too complicated. The issues go too deep. But he agrees a 28-year truce on the basis that he will marry the daughter of the King of France. His first wife, Anne of Bohemia, has died in 1394, and in 1396 he marries Isabella of France, a 6-year-old girl, at a great summit meeting just south of Calais, the field of the cloth of gold, almost literally on the same spot, but the medieval equivalent. So Richard seems now to have everything where he wants it. He's got military force of his own in England. He's made peace with France. He's not about to be attacked from there. And he also clearly feels he still doesn't have the power that he ought to have in his own kingdom. And in 1397, he launches an attack on the nobles that he thinks are still standing in his way. his uncle Thomas of Woodstock, the Earl of Arundel, and the Earl of Warwick. He takes them down in 1397. Arundel is tried and executed in Parliament. Warwick is tried and imprisoned for life because he begs for mercy, weeping, and Richard enjoys that so much he agrees that his life can be spared. And Woodstock doesn't even get his moment in Parliament because Woodstock is murdered in prison. It's not announced that he's murdered, he's just died unexplainedly in prison in Calais. And this is dramatic because Richard, when he arrested them, had claimed they were plotting against him. But when the trials happen in Parliament, it's clear there is no new plot. And what they're being convicted for, accused of and convicted for, is what they'd done 10 years earlier in the crisis of the late 1380s, a crisis in which many other people had been involved and for which everyone concerned had been explicitly pardoned. So we're back again to what is the definition of treason? Who decides? Can the king simply destroy people because he chooses to in any given moment? And the two men who are most frightened of what might happen next are the two other nobles from the late 1380s who stood against him, Thomas Mowbray and Henry.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I had read Henry IV in my undergraduate years and not really understood what was going on between Mowbray and Henry, but now it becomes super clear in that they had a pact, they had accomplished what they meant to and reestablished the right rule back in the 1380s. And now it's coming back to haunt them. And I really do think it's important to emphasize, like, everyone had been pardoned. It had been put aside so that officially there was no grounds for any of these events to happen. And it's super shocking that this uncle, this royal uncle, had been murdered in prison. I think that the weight of this moment, we need to say here for a second, in that people who were living at this time would have been absolutely shocked. There's no precedent for this at all.
You're exactly right. It's shocking, it's horrifying, and it's terrifying. I think sometimes because the Tudors and the bloody beheadings of the 16th century loom so large, we can just assume that the Middle Ages were the same or worse, but they really, really weren't. Noblemen in medieval Europe very rarely got executed by their own kings. They rarely died on the battlefield because they were worth so much in ransoms that they were always worth capturing. So while medieval life was violent and dangerous, it didn't usually involve, if you were the son of a king, the threat that the next king might accuse you of something he'd already pardoned you for, stick you in prison, and then murder you. And if a king is prepared to do that, who is safe? Henry and Mowbray certainly couldn't be sure that they would be safe, but they also couldn't be sure that they could trust each other, because in this hall of mirrors, no one knows who's talking to Richard, who's trying to keep themselves safe from Richard. No, Richard seems to feel that his own security depends on making all of his subjects insecure all the time. Mm-hmm. And what that means, of course, is chaos. So Henry and Mowbray turn on each other, and Richard decrees that they must fight a duel because it's he said, God will decide by fighting a duel. And this is where the beginning of Richard II's Shakespeare's play starts, because Henry and Mowbray are about to fight a duel in earnest, trial by combat, in 1398.
Yes, and what I hadn't realized before reading your book was that this was also for the benefit of the rest of Europe, because Richard wanted to be an emperor at the same time. Like, I didn't even realize that. It's already spectacular enough on that tiny island, but doing this in order to become an emperor is
this is the thing. This bit of the story isn't usually taken very seriously by academic historians because it's so clearly ludicrous. But the point, I think, is that Richard doesn't know it's ludicrous. So the Holy Roman Empire is about to collapse into civil war. And some of the participants in that conflict know they need a stalking horse, someone who they can put up as a candidate for emperor against the one they're trying to topple. And they see Richard and they think, okay, he looks like he might fall for it. And sure enough, he does. They send delegations saying, "Sire, would you consider becoming Holy Roman Emperor?" And Richard says, "Do you know what? That sounds like a marvelous idea." Starts giving them enormous sums of money and trying to demonstrate to the watching eyes of Europe that he is a ruler who is enforcing absolute obedience in his own kingdom and can then move on to the greater glory of imperial power on the continent. it might look ridiculous and overblown to us, but the point is, I think, that Richard believed it.
Yes. And so this is a big moment. You have these two nobles are going to fight it out. And as you say in the book, it's such a big moment that other European nobles have sent heralds like, I want a first person eyewitness perspective on this. Tell me what happens. But Richard actually doesn't allow this fight to happen. And not only that, but he lets them spend the whole day basically wondering, are we going to fight to the death here or what?
That's it. I mean, it's been months in preparation, 5 months. They've been waiting for this. They've been training. They've been preparing. Henry has the most exquisite armor sent from Milan from his friend Gian Galeazzo Visconti in Milan, who he's met on his travels, who sends handmade armor and 4 armorers to fit it to the inch, to the millimeter, to the fraction of an inch to Henry's body. Mowbray has armor from Bohemia. These lists have been built outside the walls of Coventry. Everything is prepared. And Richard, for whom life, the more one looks at it, life is a theatrical performance with himself center stage, stands up just as they are about to charge at each other and says, stop. And their lances are taken from them, their horses are led away, and they have to sit back down again. And for 2 hours, nobody knows what's happening. And after 2 hours, the herald comes back out and says, the king's decision is that both of these noble men are banished from the realm, Mowbray for the rest of his life and Henry for 10 years. Now, this again is extraordinary, perplexing, unforeseen, and frightening, because neither of these men have been convicted of any crime. What are they being exiled for? What have they done? But Richard is the king, and the trouble is a bit like putting a frog in cold water and gradually heating it up. Because everyone has gone along with the destruction of Arundel and Warwick and Woodstock, and because Richard is now holding all these cards in his hand, including his private retinue and including the threat of, he's issued a general pardon to all of his subjects in Parliament and then said, but it doesn't include 50 people, and I'm not going to tell you who those 50 people are. So that could be anybody. Nobody feels safe to stand up. So Mowbray and Henry have no choice but to go into exile. But he does promise them that they can inherit any inheritance that falls to them while they're away. And yet again, he lies, because in February 1399, John of Gaunt, a broken man by this stage, dies, and Richard says, no, Henry, you may not inherit the greatest noble inheritance in the country, the Duchy of Lancaster. I'm going to take it into my own hands. And that's the last straw. Because if the king can take away the greatest inheritance in the country from the most powerful man in the country, apart from himself, then no one is safe. And Henry decides he has to come back to challenge that.
Mm-hmm. So do you think that Henry's intention was always to take the throne? He says it wasn't. He swears it wasn't. Maybe this is one of the things that bothers his conscience later, because he swears on everything that he's just coming back to get his inheritance, and he invades England. We can't call it an invasion. He comes back, he returns. And all of these friends that he's made and kept throughout his life support him. What do you think? Did he always have his eyes on the throne at this point, do you think?
Henry was a realist, and he was an intelligent man. And I think he must have known that the logic of this situation as it unfolded was that he was going to have to end up deposing Richard, because if he'd learned anything from the 22 years of Richard's reign so far, it was that Richard could not be trusted. So whatever negotiations you conducted, whatever agreement you came to, whatever rearrangement of the political structures that Richard had set up, you agreed with him. He had shown again and again and again that he would find a way to subvert it and to try then to strike back. So yes, Henry is coming to reclaim his inheritance and to see what happens, because after all, he doesn't know, he's risking everything to do this. He is explicitly going against his king's instructions. He's very lucky, and he knows he's lucky, in that Richard has chosen this moment to take his private army off to Ireland. Just shows you how little Richard understands what he's done. So he's left England, relatively speaking, defenseless. Henry comes back with a small group of friends and household men. He doesn't have an army with him, but as soon as he lands in England, men start flocking to him because what Richard has done is so dangerous, so undermines the whole basis of the relationship between the king and his subjects. So I think Henry knew that if he could gather the support, this is what it was going to come to. And I think you're absolutely right that that is one of the things that he has. There are many things by now that he has to live with, including being complicit in the destruction of his uncle Thomas of Woodstock and the others in 1397. So there's a lot that's on his conscience already. But yes, he's going to have to believe that God wants him now to step up and take the throne for himself, to save his own inheritance, but to save England at the same time.
I think that it's another thing that maybe might be difficult to see when you're looking backwards is why wasn't Richard deposed before this point? And as you were talking about before, like it couldn't have been anybody else. You couldn't have put John of Gaunt there because he was too problematic. But what Richard doesn't realize is when the second that John of Gaunt dies, there is a candidate and he just does not see it at all. So this is the earliest moment it could have happened.
Exactly. And I think Richard, all the way along, has seemed to believe that there was safety for himself as king in not having a clear-cut heir, because he showed no urgency, no keenness to have a child. His marriage to Anne of Bohemia was childless, and then he chose to marry a 6-year-old girl at the age of 29. He clearly wasn't going to have any children for a long time with Isabella. So that sense that he wants to live in an eternal present. He doesn't want to think about the future after him. And he thinks he will be safest if he has all the resources and all the loyalty, and any change of focus from all eyes being on him, he sees as a threat. But you're exactly right. While Gaunt is there as a sort of lightning rod, because no one wants Gaunt as king, that's one thing. But Henry is a leader, he's a hero, he's someone who has all the qualities you would look for in a king like his grandfather Edward III. The one thing he doesn't have is birthright, and that, of course, is the one thing that Richard still has despite everything.
Mm-hmm. And I think that one other thing that might be important to remember is when you talk about Henry risking everything, he's risking his lands and stuff, he's risking his own life, but his son is the hostage of Richard at this moment as well. So this is a gutsy move that he's making.
It's a gutsy move. He's risking everything. That's right. His eldest son, Henry, is with Richard in Ireland. It could be so easily that he would be killed at the very first news that Henry had returned. And he has 3 other sons and 2 daughters. The whole future of his family, his dynasty, his line, everything is on the line at this point. And it is a usurpation in the sense that, unlike in 1327 when Edward II had been deposed, he'd been replaced by his own son, the very young Edward III. So that was a deposition that could be papered over. This one, Henry has a claim to the throne, but it's not the claim to the throne. There are other potential contenders. And while everyone can agree, it turns out at this point that no, Richard is too dangerous, Richard must go. And there is unanimous support for the deposition at that point in the autumn of 1399. It very quickly becomes clear that a usurper is not going to be able to sit securely on the throne, because anyone who has any doubts about what happened or their own interest in what happened has alternatives to whom they can look straight away.
Yes. We are already at the end of our time, so we need to wrap this up and say what happens to Richard. Henry takes over. He takes Richard in custody. Some chroniclers say Richard's happy to hand over the throne.
That's the official story. That's with a smiling face. He abdicates and hands over to his cousin. No, he's not happy at all, clearly, but he has no choice. Henry hopes he'll be able to just send Richard into a deep, dark prison and no one will ever hear from him again, sends him up to Pontefract Castle. But the first rebellion against Henry happens. The nobles who've been closest to Richard rebel 3 months later. That rebellion is put down fairly easily, but you just can't have a living ex-king hanging around the country, however deep and dark his prison. And the next news that comes a few weeks later is that Richard has died. It's unexplained, but rumour has it that he's been starved to death. it's inevitable. Once he's been deposed, he can't be kept alive, but yet another thing that Henry will and does have to carry on his conscience.
This might be a good place to stop. And I'll be speaking with Dan Jones soon about Henry V. So maybe we need to talk about that, Henry IV's conscience. But I really hope that people will read your book and get into this, because these are stories that we have heard a lot and may have a surface understanding of. But I think that your in-depth look at this and the way that you uniquely always look at your subjects, in that you understand where they're coming from emotionally, psychologically. I think that's so important to look at, especially in this relationship. So congratulations on the book. It's wonderful.
Thank you so much, Danny. It's wonderful to hear that you think it works, but I hope people will enjoy it if they read it. Thank you.
Thank you. To find out more about Helen's work, you can visit her author page at simonandschuster.com or find her on Instagram at Helen R. Castor. Her new book is The Eagle and the Hart, The Tragedy of Richard II and Henry IV, and it drops today in the United Kingdom, October 15th in the United States and Canada. Before we go, here's Peter from medievalist.net to tell us what's on the website. What's up, Peter?
Hey, well, there's some fun news coming from European politics these days.
Wow. There's lots of news coming from European politics. What have you got in mind?
It is that the next country in Europe might be coming from a medieval religious order in Albania. The Albanian government is looking at allowing the Bektashi order, and they're like a Sufi order from the 13th century, to create their own kind of little papal state enclave within the capital city. Yeah, it's a very interesting medieval group that's kind of muddled along over the centuries. They had their highs in the 17th and 18th century, but they've had kind of tough times, and they're kind of like losing their little enclave to just people taking their land, which is kind of funny. So the Albanian prime minister has put out a message saying like this is going to happen, and it's going to be like 20 acres of land. It's going to be a little tiny state.
I'd say that's a win. That is a win.
Yeah, it went for medieval religious orders everywhere.
There you go. And don't give up other medieval religious orders. Someday you too may become a microstate.
Indeed. So we've got that, plus something I've been working on for quite a while, which is our official medievalist.net list of the top 50 works of medieval literature.
Now, I have to say, whenever you say like our, I just do the podcast. You are medievalist.net, so that when you say our list, it's not my list, because I think that Gawain should be the top and you tell me it's not.
It is not. Well, when I say our, I mean the royal, as in the royal we.
Yes.
Which is, aptly describing me, right?
I'm just saying you're taking full responsibility for this list. No one email me. No one at me. This is Peter's list. All right, Peter.
Yeah. So at the very top is Dante's The Divine Comedy.
Right. That's number one in the top 50 medieval works of literature.
Yeah. And so what I did was, in creating this, was kind of look throughout the medieval world, what has importance, and what's really important in Armenia is not important in England, and so on. So I wanted to kind of have a list that was very broad in the medieval world. So there'll be stuff that I'm sure that even top ranking medievalists will like, I've never heard of this text from India, or this Japanese text, things like that. But I hope I've done a good job at putting out there what's had a real influence around the world.
Oh, so this is most influential. It's very hard to come up with a top 50 list and not like really establish what the parameters are.
Yeah, I keep it a bit vague in this. I want people to go and debate. I want others to come up with their top 50 list. Work away at it, world listening audience.
So everyone at Peter with your suggestions for what the top 50 medieval works of literature are.
That's right. And where do they go? We've got like Arthurian stuff. We've got stuff that's kind of religious in nature. We've got a play. We have a few pieces by women as well. And of course, Romance of the Three Kingdoms is in the top 5. So.
Oh, wow. I think there's some bias here. Well, thank you, Peter, for coming on and throwing down the gauntlet about what the top medieval works of literature are and telling us what's on the website. Thanks, Peter.
Thanks.
A big shout out to all of you out there making my work possible, whether that's letting the ads play through, telling your friends about my books and podcasts, proudly wearing a 5-Minute Medievalist shirt from TeePublic, or becoming a patron at patreon.com. You can listen to the Medieval Podcast ad-free on Patreon for less than the cost of your annual venti pumpkin spice latte. So if you love this podcast, please consider joining the Patreon community to help me keep it going. You can find out how at patreon.com/medievalists. For everything from royal cousins to baker's dozens, follow medievalist.net on Facebook or X at medievalists. You can find me, Danièle Cybulskie, across social media at 5MIN Medievalist or 5-Minute Medievalist. And you can find my books at all your favorite bookstores, where you can get hold of Chivalry and Courtesy, Medieval Manners for a Modern World, now out in hardcover, ebook, and audiobook. Our music is Beyond the Warriors by Guy Frog. Thanks for listening, and have yourself an awesome day.